It's nice to be back in BC. Just a few opening words about this new role of Secretary for the Service of Faith. There are 4 secretaries in the society, one for higher education, one for secondary education, one for justice and ecology, and then the most recent one is the Secretary for the Service of Faith. It came as a complete surprise to me. When I finished at Oxford, I thought I was heading to BC, but Father Leahy must have been praying very hard, because completely unexpectedly, I got the summons to come to Rome and BC was saved. So it's very nice to be at least with you virtually. So it's a huge job, this Secretary for the Service of Faith, and we're still finding our way with it. It's first of all to make the dimension of faith more explicit in all our academic and apostolic commitments, then to find the ways of increasing our evangelization according to our own charism in a deeply secularized world, and also a world which is split and dominated by religious fundamentalism and political fundamentalism. Then there's also the promotion of Ignatian spirituality as a source of our apostolic renewal. And finally, the question of encouraging and facilitating ecumenism and inter-religious dialogue. So you may ask, what do I do in my spare time? Well, in my spare time, I won't tell you what I do in my spare time. I rather like Irish whiskey, so that comes into play quite a bit. And it's a great source of consolation, although it is a preceding cause. So here we are. I want to just explore with you on the 25th anniversary of the Centre's foundation, how important the Centre is, and Father General's address at BC in August to the International Association of Jesuit Universities made that clear in his speech, that our spirituality is not just an add-on, it's actually at the very center of our life and determines not just who we are, but also our way of doing things, our way of coming into the world and working. If you're not familiar with the 4 universal apostolic preferences, the first one, which the Pope endorses as the most important and foundational one, is to show the way to God through the spiritual exercises and discernment. So right at the very heart of the Society's mission and of its works is this reality of the spiritual exercises. The spiritual exercises inform and establish the way in which the Society is, right from the very beginning. Of all the different works that they were committed to doing, it was clearly the exercises and the giving of the exercises that really informed them, because they had been formed and shaped in the exercises. Now, you may be familiar with some of the jargon of the exercises, the freedom, the language of election, the 2 standards, discernment, conversions, finding God in all things. But I want to emphasize, although it may be familiar, it's not jargon, in fact. It's actually experiential language. And you find it running through all the major documents of the Society, right from the very beginning, from the formula of the Institute and the constitutions, right through to the latest decrees of the General Congregation 36. So it's something that is lived and something that is experienced, but not just for the Society, because the exercises are regarded as quite a remarkable gift given to Ignatius, given to the Society for the world and for the Church. It's also the exercises that hold us all together as Jesuits. If you think of the size of the Society of Jesus right throughout the world, the tremendous variety of people, of Jesuits doing all different things, of different personalities, the one thing that we have in common is the spiritual exercises and the experience of the spiritual exercises. So in a funny sort of way, it runs deeper. The exercises run deeper than simply a rule that is to be obeyed. The exercises, we return to them again and again as a source of inspiration and of renewal. They have to be done and experienced. They're not simply a textbook. One of the best ways of summing up what we find in the exercises and what I think becomes the society's sort of habitual way of seeing and working is a phrase by Hugo Rahner, the brother of Karl Rahner, who talks about the apostolic mysticism of the exercises. And so anyone who makes the exercises, who's engaged in or has some sort of contact with, will find that they begin to be touched by this apostolic mysticism. So the first UAP, to show the way to God. Now already as we come into the exercises, there's a series of what's called annotations at the beginning. There are 22 annotations. The book of the exercises is really a textbook for the director, the one who's accompanying the retreatant. And the annotations are there to give you sort of instructions. I want to just quickly illustrate why those annotations become important, because you'll find that this is a characteristic Jesuit way of living, Jesuit way of approaching the world, and of engaging in apostolic work. The most radical annotation is annotation 15. And this was the annotation that got Ignatius into trouble with the Inquisition, because there Ignatius, out of his own experience, says that the director should always permit the Creator and Lord to deal directly with the creature, and the creature to deal directly with his or her Creator or Lord. So suddenly there's a whole emphasis on this personal engagement, this personal relationship with God. It's not mediated in that sense. And you can see immediately how it becomes a threat to the church, the institution, particularly at a time which is facing the disturbance of the Reformation or the disturbance of the Illuminati in Spain. It begins to look too much subjective, too big an authority claim, a personal authority claim, over against that of the church. But the discovery of that God dealing directly with us is it's a God who acts pro me, for me. It's a very deeply personal thing, which is not exclusive. And also within that, then, out of that engagement, that encounter with God, comes this balance and this freedom in finding what God wants us to do. So that very radical annotation 15. Then we have annotation 22. Now, annotation 22 is fascinating because it says it's necessary to suppose that every good Christian is more ready to put a good interpretation on another's statement than to condemn it as false. It's a tremendous hermeneutic of charity. And imagine if you took that annotation and you applied it in your own academic discourses, if you applied it in your political discourses in our society at the moment, how that would be transformative, starting from that hermeneutic of charity to help the other person to understand their narrative and their position. It becomes effective very quickly when the society gets involved in Reformation Germany. When they go to set up the university, the Ingolstadt in 1549, what is the instruction? The instruction is not to engage the Protestants in a knockout sort of apologetic, but to make friends and to engage in charity. So these are small examples of how the exercises already begins to shape and form the society, its self-understanding, and its way of doing things. Okay. So that's it. But you notice it says showing the way to God through the exercises. But the question that we would want to ask today, that is all around us today, is whose God? Whose God are we looking for? Are we going to encounter? You may be already familiar with James Baldwin. In my regard as one of the first big sort of Black liberation theologians. In an essay of Baldwin's called Down at the Cross, in a collection called Fire the Next Time, Baldwin puts this question very directly. This is a quotation. But in the end, it is the threat of universal extinction hanging over all the world today that changes totally and forever the nature of reality and brings into devastating question the true meaning of man's history. We human beings now have the power to exterminate ourselves. This seems to be the entire sum of our own achievement. We have taken this journey and arrived at this place in God's name. This then is the best that God, the white God, can do. If that is so, then it is time to replace him. Replace him with what? And this void, this despair, this torment is felt everywhere in the West, from the streets of Stockholm to the churches of New Orleans and the sidewalks of Harlem. Baldwin then goes on to say, let's replace him with a black God, but that's not satisfactory either, because if the white God hasn't delivered us, then neither can the black God. So Baldwin and many others put the question, who is God? And in theological discourse and into our social discourse, that question hangs. I want to suggest very quickly, because we don't have time, I want to suggest that, in fact, one of the extraordinary things about the spiritual exercises and the remarkable God of the exercises is that the God of the exercises is not culturally bound. Yes, you'll find that the exercises are in the language of the period and in the imagery of the period, somewhere between a sort of medieval world and the Renaissance world and the new world that is coming, early modernism that's beginning. But actually, the God that we encounter is not a white God, a black God, anybody else's God. It's the God that I discover. It's the God who comes to me. And it's a God who's open and experienced and who is there to be experienced. It's not speculative. God is not speculative. And we encounter this God, and the common phrase that Ignatius uses is as creator and Lord. He uses it in one form or another 199 times in the exercises. So who is this God that we can't really put a name on, that refuses to fit into our categories, but nevertheless calls us into this personal experience? Well, first of all, it's a God of mercy. It's a God who knows us deeply and knows our brokenness, our fragility, our capacity for deception and self-deception. This is the God that we stand before in paragraph 60 of the exercises. And it's before the crucified Christ, but not as condemnatory, not as the one in judgment, but as the one who loves in mercy and liberates me. So it's out of the gift of truth, knowing myself, I experience not judgment, not rejection, but liberation and gratitude. And I understand that this mercy is genuine because it's lived with cost. It's the crucified Christ, God of mercy. The next encounter is at the very beginning of the second week of the exercises, when we move from that redemption from sin and understanding of the patterns of sin in our life and in our world, and indeed in cosmic history. We move into how God looks at our world. God looks at the world, the Trinity is the way in which Ignatius sees it, looking down on world, not to reject it, but to say, what can I do? What can we do to bring about the healing and the salvation of this world? So it's a God of compassion for the world that we experience. And as we journey into that God of compassion, who comes to us and comes into a broken world, even a world that rejects this God, as we journey on that way with God, we discover that this is a God who is on mission. And this mission is one of a saving love that has no boundaries, that cannot be exhausted, and it transforms history from within history. It's the incarnate God for whom there are no obstacles. The next, out of that, we then discover the strangeness of this God who calls us. It's not a God who works alone. It's a God who calls us in friendship to be his companions in this mission. St. Thomas Aquinas says that the high point of Christian life is friendship with God. Using John's Gospel there, I call you friends. In this moment, we experience God making us God's friends, calling us into this saving mission. And we encounter that in different ways. We encounter it in terms of the two standards, the very dramatic sort of parable at the heart of the exercises, where our freedom to follow Christ is really tested On the one hand, you have what Ignatius calls the enemy of human nature. Very interesting to attend to the very dramatic imagery of that. This is the one who operates by fear and deception and casts nets that entangle us and distort our understanding and distort our sense of self, to imprison us. Operates by fear and by power. The other side, the other standard where we find Christ, is the one who doesn't force us, who doesn't work by fear, who calls us to work with him and to follow him in humility, even into suffering. But it's a free offer, and to be his companions in that, in the work of redemption and liberation. So what we have then is the God who comes to us offering us communion. And it's a God that we discover who is laboring and working in all things. Fascinating phrase. It's not a passive God. It's not a monotheistic sort of absolute that we contemplate. It's a God deeply, deeply involved in our lives and in our history, laboring and working, a salvific healing work. And it doesn't matter who we are, doesn't matter what the color of our skin, doesn't matter what our social status, doesn't matter what shape or form we come in. That's the God who comes and labors and works for us. So, out of all of that, as we make that journey and that encounter, and we're drawn in, finally, in the fourth week of the exercises, we encounter Christ, God, the Consoler, the resurrected Christ. And Ignatius uses a very simple but very profound phrase, that Christ comes to console us as a friend consoles a friend. Again, no judgment, no harsh condemnation, but that invitation that we belong with him, and he is on our side, and he is walking with us. The Holy Father, in his recent letter on the Eucharist, has this phrase: Christian faith is either an encounter with him alive, Christ alive, or it does not exist. There is no Christ who is not the risen Christ. Any other Christ, no matter how cleverly we construct it, no matter what way we work with it, any other Christ who is not the risen Christ is not Christ. And that's, again, a fundamental moment of encounter in the exercises, because only the risen Christ can be the source of our hope, can actually be the one who can call us into a genuine mission of healing and restoring the world. So you can see these different modes, these different ways, these different relationships, and its deepening and enrichment of who is this God. And that's a question that goes to each one of us. Who is the God that makes this claim upon me? Who is this God that I want to follow? And so that's the God that shapes the horizon of the exercises, that shapes the Jesuit understanding of the world, a world in which God is laboring and working, and in which we are laboring and working with God. But at the end of the exercises is this famous contemplation ad amorem, the contemplatio ad amorem. It's the contemplation for the love of God, to attain the love of God. And I want just to dwell on that for a moment, because I want to put some ideas there which you won't find normally around. It's very interesting. In the traditional scholastic language of his time, Aquinas, in the Summa, Part 1, Question 8, Article 3, asks, God dwells in all things by essence, power, and presence. So God is present in our world. And it's quite a metaphysics that's developed of this, of God's presence sustaining life. Ignatius transforms that metaphysics of God's presence and translates it into an affective and intellectual recognition of the presence, experienced and also called into this living relationship of salvation. It's a liberating grace of encountering God's loving, life-giving presence, which also calls us to respond. It's the grace of reciprocity. All through the exercises, that's the fundamental dynamic. I encounter God, and out of that encounter, what can I give? What can I do? So we find that running especially and concentrated in this great contemplatio, because there Ignatius invites us to see God indwelling in all things. And he almost becomes a poet. He invites us to imagine as water flows from its fountains, as light flows from the sun, so God's life and love permeates all things and sustains them in life. That's also the majesty and the glory of God. Majesty and glory is mentioned 26 times in the exercises, but it's the majesty of a salvific love, which we perceive and know in gratitude, in wonder and grateful awe. This majesty is not pushing God away from us. This majesty is a sort of intimacy, of indwelling, in which we are grateful and recognize the many blessings we've received. In paragraph 234 of the exercises, I will ponder with great affection, with great love, and out of that comes the gift of self. Take, Lord, and receive. So we have been transformed and are in the process of being transformed, with new eyes, new understanding, new freedom to act, redemptive, reconciling, and loving actions, which bring about not just this communio with God, this communio with neighbor and with the whole of creation. I want to suggest that the contemplatio comes out of that resurrected Christ. And as you know from John's Gospel, the first words that the resurrected Christ offers to his disciples is, peace be with you. Peace be with you. So I want to call this as the Shalom of the kingdom, the contemplatio as the Shalom of God's living presence in our world and the kingdom. Because it's not just a simple greeting. It's the greeting of the risen Christ who removes all fear. And it also declares the new peace, the new Shalom of the kingdom. For now all things are reconciled. And John links it to the gift of the Spirit and to mission, to forgive and to reconcile, to be the new ministers of this peace of the risen Christ. The Shalom contemplatio then is not just a state, a sort of mystical state in which we are sort of permanently happy. The Shalom contemplatio is in fact a mission. It is the reality in which the risen Christ invites us when he bestows his own Spirit. That Shalom character of the new life of the kingdom is the presence and foretaste of the eternal peace that God is, and it's the mission that entails a transformational work in ourselves, in our society, and in our world. It's also to be part of the mission that we have for the whole of creation. It cannot be brought about without justice and forgiveness and the creative restoration of all life that has been lost or destroyed. So that means that the contemplatio is also an ethical reality. So this is how this contemplatio takes us into a new key in our life and in our mission and in our work. It also allows us to understand how this world has become our home, our genuine home, because Christ and God living and working and dwelling in this makes us at home in our world, and also the responsibilities we have to our world as our home. But it also allows us to understand the pain and the suffering of the world, because we are so finely attuned to the action of God. Therefore, we are witnesses and apostles of the Shalom and risen Christ, and to fail to act, to meet the pain, to meet the suffering with justice, forgiveness, and reconciliation, to be deaf to injustice, to be deaf to the cry of the poor, to be deaf to the suffering of creation, is to deliberately choose to live in the world as if Christ had not been crucified and raised, as if the Holy Spirit had not been poured out. Because the contemplatio and our freedom that we have been given to enter into this contemplatio is the great amplifier of the cry of all living things. It's the cry of heaven and earth for liberation, to be what God has created it to be, to give its Magnificat of praise. So the contemplatio is also the hymn of victory and of hope. It's the world in which the Holy Spirit is constantly at work, and it's a celebration of life called to peace with one another and with God. So this is the God who introduces us not just to God's self, but also to the world with new eyes, with a new sense of who we are. An interesting connection here with the American philosopher Nicholas Wolterstone, who captures what I would call the contemplatio shalom. And this is what he says about shalom. Shalom is the flourishing in all one's relationships, to God, one's fellow human beings, to oneself, to the natural world, to society, and to culture. It has both a normative component, being rightly related, and an affective component, finding joy in being so related. I think this is the reality of the contemplatio to which the exercises and the God of the exercises leads us. And what deeper mission can we all have than to show the way to this God, to open up a path to this God, to create new sites in which people, no matter how much in despair or alienated they may feel, can encounter this God. So that's the God that we are called into in that first universal apostolic preference. It's the God who embraces our suffering, but also redeems it. It's a God of faith and faithfulness, and it also opens up in our faithfulness the gift of consolation of faith, hope, and love. So in some sense, we live this mission with this God for the life of the world. The Center for Ignatian Spirituality is more than just a house on the BC campus. It is a well from which the whole of the community may draw the water of life. It is more than a department. It is an enduring and radical witness to the encounter with this living God, the one, the risen Christ, who is the condition of all that we are and all that we do. And I think this is the gift which God, through Ignatius and also through all those who joined him, offers to all the world. It is the gift that the Society of Jesus has and gives in the name of him whose name we also carry. Thank you. I'm not hearing anybody.
I think, can you hear now?
Yep.
No.
Okay, you can hear me now, Father Hanvey?
Yes, very clearly, thank you.
Okay, thank you for the talk, very thought-provoking, very expansive. I'm Tim Muldoon, I'm in the philosophy department here. I teach on discernment, I've written on Ignatian spirituality. Obviously, I and the rest of the people in this room are within the context of a university, and so I'd love to hear you reflect a little bit on how you see the particular task of educators within the university context. What do you see as the ways to explore, implement? I'm particularly struck by that image that you mentioned towards the end of opening a path toward the God of the to be encountered in the exercises. What do you see as some of the dimensions of that task in the context of a university?
Thank you. I think I see it precisely as doing that, of opening up a path, but also of creating a community, because it's not just an individual experience. I'm more and more convinced that we need our universities have such a formative role, but precisely through being the sorts of communities that enhance people's inquiry, not just academically, but also in their relationalities. And I remember in Marquette in October with the mission officers, there was a very interesting report given on the mental health of students post-COVID, and the difficulties with socialization, the anxiety, and all the rest of it. So here, I think we have a primary work of healing, but also as a community to do that, because we support one another, and we mediate our faith to one another, and no one is excluded from that. I think that's the great thing about the exercises. No one, I mean, for me, people can come into the exercises at any level, but it's that faith that God deals directly with the person in the way that is appropriate for them at that moment. You know, so I think it's creating a way. I think it's what I would call also creating a sites of encounter. For instance, I think that the UAPs themselves constitute sites. So going and working and listening to the narratives of people that are poor and oppressed in Boston, not just in the Ukraine or not just in the Sudan, but in Boston, in our own communities, those who are excluded, listening, first of all, to their narratives, that accompanying them. Then that whole idea of our care of our common home with others. Because for many young people today, they may have given up on God, but actually there is already a seed being sown. Suddenly we're being aware that this world is our home and it's the only home we have. And that instead of exploiting it, we need another relationship with it. So it's in that movement that something else opens up for us. And I would just say, maybe in a very Jesuit way, it's all grace. It's all grace. And as you know, as educators, and I know maybe I'm the oldest educator in the room, certainly feels like that from time to time, you can't account for the seeds that you sow. The things you say sometimes just offhand, or the things that you do maybe offhand, but later in somebody's life, suddenly it bears fruit. So really, I think this work of education is in fact a great act of faith. And it is a work in which God is active. We are educating with God and for God in that. Does that make sense? You have lots of experience in this. So I'm very open to how you want to share with that. I think one of the things too, I think in this community that we would want to build, I really do want to come back to that annotation 22 about putting a good construction on things, because I think we're all aware politically how the political rhetoric is so destructive, and it contaminates our ordinary discourse and our ordinary relationships. It takes us away from the good that we're seeking. But I also want to suggest that it's also the work that we have to do at the moment for the church. That if we can get this, what I would call this hermeneutic of charity, which actually, you know, as in the first letter of John, he says that love casts out fear. So much of the polemic and the negativity is produced by fear. But if we can approach that in one another, genuinely trying to hear how the Spirit is working in one another, then I think we get a new sense of church and belonging rather than of exclusion and of bitterness. Because the church cannot survive if it's divided in the way in which it can be divided. That's one of the things I want to emphasize on.
I have two questions, actually. So I think that this university has many resources, and I think it is wonderful that we have the Center for Unity and Spirituality but I would like to ask you, you have the big vision, and well, first of all, if you could let us know, are there other centers similar like this, or are there other universities also that also offer these kinds of resources? just maybe it will be out of curiosity or out of just learning from someone who has a bigger vision. And the other question will be, so if you had any recommendation for the center, so if you think that there will be some specific issues that in the next 25 years will be interesting also to emphasize. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tomu, for your faith that you will be here in 25 years. I applaud you for that. Who knows in university life what goes on? But I think, first of all, I think that there are not exactly, I mean, I think in some ways BC is unique in having this extraordinary resource. I think other universities do have elements of it, may not be in the same way, and other programs and all the rest of it. So I think you're right. I think there's work to be done there in networking. I know that Father Christie, who's the new Secretary for Higher Education, is setting up or has set up a working party or task force for Ignatian spirituality in the universities and others. So hopefully that will bring a network together. But I would just we just recently, 2 weeks ago, held here a conference on secularization in Europe. And it was attended by the spiritual delegates for the provinces in Europe. And it was a very fruitful meeting because we're all having to wrestle with this in one form or another. So I would say that maybe there's an opportunity here for the center to facilitate and to host and to bring together, to build that network, to build that community around particular themes, like secularization, like synodality, like the divided church, however, but to bring the resources of the exercises to that. One of the other great projects that I'm involved in is using in the very important work of reconciliation, political reconciliation and cultural reconciliation, using the resources of the exercises, working with one of the institutes in Cali in Bogota, in the Javeriana. They recognize that they have a wonderful program for reconciliation between the different factions in Colombia. But they also recognize there was a deep spiritual need here, because you're not just dealing with people carry these painful histories, and it's very difficult to break out of those. And so spirituality, particularly the Ignatian one, can be such a wonderful resource and creative resource and all that. So these are just some ideas. And I think that you have such an extraordinary resource there. And you also have the expertise in BC to help pull that together. And that would be a great service, not just to the society, but I think to the church, actually.
Okay. Father, thank you very much for your reflections on the spiritual exercises. I made them many years ago now. I'm a Catholic sister. I've been working with the Jesuits for almost about 40 years. I was here at BC for 22, at Holy Cross before that for 13. I'm a product of Jesuit education in Toronto. But I was very interested to hear just your mention of the synodality process. And I grew up in graduate school with a person who was a peritos at the council, Gregory Baum. And he came back from the council and said, this was the most exciting thing in my life. I would love it because I see the potential for synodality to be, for this generation, the most exciting thing in their lives. But unfortunately, it has been very little publicized. Here in BC, we have done some wonderful things, actually led by students, to learn about it, to learn what it means to walk the path, to widen the tent. And I think a huge, I love you're bringing out the hermeneutic of charity, because a huge problem, I think, is students feeling the lack of being included. Yes. For whatever reason. It could be race, it could be poverty, it could be sexual orientation. And I think in terms of creating a community, I think that's where we have a big challenge to exercise first in our dealing with social media and how we talk with one another in terms of thinking about this. What is it? Article 22? Was
Yes.
that? Yes. Anyway, so thank you very much. You've given me a great inspiration.
I co-chair the Commission on Spirituality for the Synod in this here, and I'm on some of the theological reflection task forces for it. What is fascinating and sometimes problematic is that this is something that we're all learning, and we need to give one another the space to learn. And there are going to be mistakes. There's no doubt about that. But we're learning how to be. And I think what Pope Francis does is suddenly this expansion to bring in the whole church. And for him, that is also necessary for the mission of the church. And I think that there's something very profound happening there. I don't think it's going to happen overnight. I don't think it's going to happen either in October 23 or in October 24. We're on the road. And of course, the problem is that wide consultation and in the document produced for the Continental Faith brought up all the different voices, all the problematic voices. They cannot be resolved in one synod or in any synod. They have to be resolved in a different way. So this church is in this process of being led by the Spirit. We produced the Commission for Spirituality produced a document towards a spirituality for synodality, and also a collection of scriptural texts might help. But when I was looking at the scriptural texts on the Council of Jerusalem, it's fascinating in the Council of Jerusalem, the big dispute about whether you can eat with Gentiles or, you have to keep the purity of your Jewish Christian faith and all the rest of it. It's very interesting there that Peter and Paul are witnesses to what the Spirit is doing. It's a Spirit that's opening up new possibilities for the church. And it's the church that comes to recognize that. And I think we're in a similar situation. However, I would simply gloss and say, once the church saw what the Holy Spirit was doing, it got frightened and it closed the Holy Spirit down and gave it to the bishops to take over again. Oh, you didn't hear me say that.
I agree. That's the guy's way.
I think one of the great things about the Synodal thing, I would like to see it move us into a deeper appreciation and reflection of our ecclesial faith and of the gift that the church is. When I was working with our bishops' conference, a lot of it was firefighting negative publicity or negative things and all that. And what that tended to do was to exclude the extraordinary things that the church was doing in very difficult situations. Often after the state agencies had moved out or whatever, the church was there. The church agencies was there. So I think we need to recover again our love and our faith in this church. And the simple rule I have for that is that Christ never abandons his church. And so if Christ doesn't abandon it, how can I? If I'm following Christ, this is where he is, this is where I am. So I think we need to come back to that at a different level. Thank you.